Political violence in the U.S. has reached epic proportions due to the polarization in the country. One example, the U.S. President Joe Biden has accused his predecessor Donald Trump and his supporters of undermining democracy ahead of next week's midterm elections. Some Republican candidates have said that they may refuse to accept the outcome should they lose. This comes on top of the most recent act of violence against the husband of the U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who was attacked with a hammer. How have U.S. politics reached a point where politicians are threatening each other and Americans are acting out violently? Let me introduce our guest for this edition of the Spotlight. Activist and commentator Don DeBar joins us from Austin, New York. Also joining us is journalist and author Daniel Lazare, also joining us from New York. Okay, welcome to you both. So we are continuing this U.S. political violence theme in another episode of our program, and we deemed it to be that important, and I mentioned that in the last time we had that to both of you, because there were some revelations that were unprecedented in a sense, which is not associated on the mainstream outside of the U.S. perhaps, in terms of the depth of what this really means. So we had this attack. Daniel Lazare, first start with you, where you had Nancy Pelosi's husband, and I remember last time I made a mistake saying axe. Anyways, he was hit with a hammer, but the person who was looking for her, for the U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, of which he said that he would injure her. Now the question comes about is this just a lone incident of somebody, an American, acting out in this form and manner, which is obviously very violent?
Well, it's hard to say, but it's definitely, there's no question that tempers are rising, that tensions are increasing. There is a huge degree of polarization. People are very angry, and there's a great deal of talk of violence in the air. I mean, after all, on January 6, 2021, we had a mob invade Washington. 4 or 5 people were killed. The mob, members of the mob chanted, where is Nancy? Where is Nancy? Nancy Pelosi is a polarizing figure, and they engaged in a great deal of destruction, and would likely have killed Nancy Pelosi if they'd gotten their hands on her. Probably is the same thing true for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others. So there's a real danger of violence because the machinery of government is breaking down, and as it breaks down, anger and frustration are increasing on all sides.
Don DeBar, isn't it a far cry though to have people, average Americans, in a matter of speaking, act out against politicians in a way? Well, I guess they mentioned the January 6th incident that happened there on Capitol Hill. For them to come out and want to kill their lawmakers, the U.S. politicians, how should one view that?
Well, let's look at it through the prism of the editorial pages of the New York Times in July 2018, where after Donald Trump met with Vladimir Putin to try to calm relations between the two countries, accused Trump of treason, and there were calls for him to be prosecuted for that, which, by the way, carries the death penalty. Let's start there. This is something that's been tracked at Pew Research, for example, did a study in 2014 looking at the period from 1994 to 2014, and shows the entrenchment of this polarization where large chunks of people on the left and right, quote unquote, these terms are really kind of meaningless right now, but the liberal and conservative are the terms they used in their study, of the Democratic and Republican parties, respectively, how the number of Democrats that identified as liberal and Republicans that identified as conservatives had grown and hardened. The phenomenon really didn't begin in 1994. It began much earlier, of course. I remember the presidential election in 1980, for example. At the time, however, Democrats that identified as liberals were, among other things, anti-war, for example. One of the big fears of Reagan being elected in 1980 was that he would start a war with the Soviet Union. Here we are with someone who everyone calls in the political economy here a liberal, Joe Biden, is actually at war with Russia. There's a lot of stuff to really sort of plod through here. There's just one last point because I want clarity
Sure.
on this from the last conversation that we had. Dan correctly referred to the fact that there is this other process where if there's a block, basically if the vote from each state at the joint session in January 6th is rejected, then the electors are chosen by a different mechanism than in other words, not voted on by the House members, but rather by people that are selected to do that job. As a matter of fact, you would never get there because you would first have votes in each of the two chambers on the challenges, and in each of those cases, those votes would be conducted in houses of Congress that had Democratic majorities on January 6, 2021. So the idea that somehow that insurrection was tied to a strategy for a coup d'etat, really, it just falls.
Okay, very well. Let's look at how long this has been going on, this term political violence, and of course the way that it has now really brought into the fore, Daniel Lazare. I mean, I went back as far as Abe Lincoln and the assassination that happened there, of which the person that did it said, I did what I thought was best. And then you had some periodicals that wrote that the Almighty God has ordered this event. And I mentioned that in terms of the periodicals, and I want to kind of compare that to, or make a note of what our guest there, Dan DeBar, said, that the New York Times, as a media, or print media, is also lending a hand in the way that things become polarized by drawing that type of analysis. So are we looking as that as being something that has happened from way before and is just continued throughout the decades in the U.S.?
Well, not quite. I mean, first of all, Lincoln was assassinated at the very end of a civil war, which claimed 600,000 lives in a country at the time that had a population of about 24 million. So, it was a bloody, bloody war, a huge war, and it culminated with the assassination of the leader of the Union forces. But after that, things died down. There was little of that sort of thing in Washington. But beginning in the 1960s, 1968, we saw a series of assassinations of Martin Luther King, Robert F. Kennedy. We saw the assassination of JFK in '63. But there's no doubt that passions have been heating up since the 1990s in a new way. The machinery of government is breaking down. We have had gridlock, an absolute deadlock in Congress for 30 years or so. Nothing can get done, and the less that gets done, the more frustrations rise on either side, and the more poisonous the atmosphere
Give us an
becomes.
example.
Well, Newt Gingrich shut down the government on 2 different occasions. They impeached Bill Clinton for the crime of having a sexual, engagement with with a White House aide. Each of these things, sort of raised tempers to new levels, and there was no way of resolving these things because the angrier Republicans got, then the angrier Democrats got, and the more Congress stopped working. Uh-huh. The American government is based on this bizarre 18th century system of checks and balances. Basically, you have to have 3 or even 4 major institutions agree before anything can get done. That's the House, the Senate, the presidency, and the Supreme Court. And if each of those bodies has veto power. So what you found starting in the mid-90s was that that Congress and the presidency were vetoing one another constantly, and nothing happened. Nothing got done. And the more of a stalemate you had, the angrier people got. And then the angrier they got, the more they dug their heels in.
I see.
So the process is kind of self-fueling. And so tempers are now shooting upwards. We'll see what happens on the election on Tuesday. But I think that there's no doubt that the basic governmental functions in the U.S. are hanging in the balance. And American democracy, such as it is facing a major crisis. I rarely agree with Joe Biden about anything, but in this case, he is correct. The country is facing a major structural crisis.
Well, Don DeBar, since our guest here mentioned the midterms, looking at what the latest is on Joe Biden, who has obviously made a point to call upon the midterms and says, basically saying that, this is something that is chipping away at the U.S. democracy, and that we can't, this shouldn't be happening. Why is the midterms going to be a reflection of this, in the sense that Joe Biden is painting that picture? Do you agree with him?
He has to paint that picture. First of all, look at Biden's own numbers. His numbers are the lowest for any sitting president since the day before Nixon resigned. That's a fact. And it's been that way for a good while now. He needs some sort of a distraction, or they're going to lose both houses, and he may well be impeached. That's a fact also. Let's start with JFK, who was assassinated in November 1963. Malcolm X, who was assassinated in February 1965. Martin Luther King in April of 1968. Robert Kennedy in June of 1968. In each case, security forces inside the United States have at least been implicated if they have not been held responsible. Okay, if we look further, if you want to talk about political violence, hold the picture of Muammar Gaddafi after he was run with a spear or a gun with a knife on it, whatever you call it, a bayonet. And the words, we came, they saw, he died. That's out of Hillary Clinton's mouth. I don't know how anyone can be sanctimonious about political violence when that's their team. Mm-hmm. This is something, again, and you asked, I missed it because when we talk at the same time over these media, I can't hear when you, etc. You asked when H. Rap Brown said that violence is as American as apple pie, and it was in 1967. So that's in the midst of the assassinations that I just ran. We've seen political assassinations all the way up to an attempt today where they tried to kill Imran Khan. I'm guessing if you find a dirty hand there, if the assassin, the attempted assassin, actually the assassin, because he did kill some other people, if they actually get him to trial, you may find out that the U.S. had a hand in that. Or look at Dugina. Darla, whatever her name is, Dugin's daughter. That assassination. Certainly the U.S. or the U.K., the Ukrainians, etc., had a hand in that. This is political violence. This is real political violence. The attempts on Castro's life, over the course of his time in office in Cuba, the attempts on Nicolas Maduro's life. I mean, this is U.S. policy. Sure. Why suddenly is a guy with horns a major threat to the U.S. democracy? I don't understand it. It's so absurd.
It is. And perhaps, now we're talking about the international arena and how the U.S. acts regarding that. But we're focusing on the U.S. here, so we have to go with that line for this program.
Malcolm X and Martin Luther King were domestic, and so were the two Kennedys.
Oh, that's true. That's true. Okay. To expand further on what Joe Biden said there, Daniel Lazare, which is what we're getting at here in some sense, or what I'm trying to get at from you, is the fact that political violence, according to U.S. President Joe Biden, he has said that it is undermining democracy. And he says, make no mistake, democracy is on the ballot for all of us. Do you agree with him?
I do, actually, yes. I mean, first of all, let me say that Don is correct. I mean, the U.S. has pursued violent policies abroad, for decades. And the assassination of Qasem Soleimani is just merely one example of U.S. policy. But the U.S. domestically has been kind of sort of a democracy all this period, and that matters too. People can speak their mind. I can write whatever I want to without worrying about the police breaking down my door. And elections have been, in general, kind of decided in a fair and democratic manner. But that is breaking down dramatically. Joe Biden's speech was it was classic Joe Biden. Joe Biden doesn't admit that the American system, as it presently exists, is falling apart before our very eyes. So it isn't that the Republicans are doing this single-handedly. The Republicans are merely acting in response to what is plainly a systemic collapse. American political institutions are 235 years old. They have never been subject to a fundamental overhaul. The system is so old, so out of date, so unresponsive to the needs of modern society, it's not funny. And yet the system is so frozen that any kind of reform is impossible. So we have an electoral college, a Senate which is unrepresentative. We have a Senate which is grossly unrepresentative. In the Senate, a majority of the population lives in just 10 states that are outvoted by the minority in the other 40. In the House, which is supposedly more democratic, Republicans have enjoyed a 12 or 14% advantage since 2010. And now in the Supreme Court, Republicans have a unbreakable 6-3 majority. And that majority will persist for probably another decade. They have got a free hand to do whatever they want with American society, and the Democratic majority is powerless. So Americans live under a minority dictatorship, and that dictatorship is growing.
That's an interesting way of putting it. Americans living under a dictatorship. Well, Don DeBar, based on what Daniel Lazare there said, are we looking at a solution which is far-fetched, but then again is something that could be put out there, and that is of reform, which I think Daniel Lazare said a reform is not even possible at this point, that you need an overhaul, I guess, of the whole system, so to speak. I mean, is that something that, but is that feasible? Is that realistic to look at it that way? And is that a cause of what we call, one of the outcomes being a political violence that has been part of U.S. politics and mainstream, the mainstream average Joe on the streets there in the U.S.?
First, I'll agree in part with what Daniel just said about there being a systemic problem. Some evidence of that. I did a Google search for illegitimate president and qualified it before 12/31/2019. Hillary Clinton, here's a headline from the Independent in the UK. Hillary Clinton says Trump knows he's an illegitimate president. There's quotes and such. Former President Jimmy Carter says Trump is an illegitimate president. That's from Vox and NBC News. He lost, this is a quote, he lost the election and he was put into office because the Russians interfered on his behalf. This has been going on certainly since the 2016 election in depth. And let's not forget that there were mobs. There's no, if what was outside the Capitol was a mob on January 6th, 2021, there were mobs on Inauguration Day in 2017 and lots of other occasions like during the Supreme Court appointments of Kavanaugh and others. This is something that I agree that there's a breakdown here. What I don't agree is that the solution is going to be somehow to redo the Constitution because it's 235 years old, because the first question that arises is who exactly is going to be in charge of that process. Because the real problem is that there is power that is much greater than the construct of that 235-year-old Constitution that sits on top of an empire around the world. And that is who would be handling the rewrite of the U.S. Constitution. And my guess is that the first target would be the Bill of Rights. And so, we have some serious structural problems. The structural problems that we have is we have the largest military in the world. That's a bipartisan effort. I don't know how you vote for democracy in the face of that when each party does nothing but increase the military budget and the reach of the military across the planet every time they're voted in. That's the problem that we have. I think our structural problems are a lot deeper than the old documents.
Sure. Well, the problems are so deep that there's not many, but there are some publications out there, Daniel Lazare, that have even mentioned. Daniel Lazare, are you with us?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay, great. That there's been talk about dividing the U.S. along the red and blue states. I mean, there's even been talks of that. So is that how deep this problem of political violence is, that it needs to go in that direction? I mean, we've heard about that. There's even been states that have said that they want to separate themselves from the U.S. But then overall, what about that approach? What's your thoughts on that?
I don't think that approach will work. I mean, that's a neo.
Not that it works, but what do you think about the fact that it went there?
I think it shows how polarized things are, and how the country is splitting up geographically as well as ideologically. There's no doubt about that. But listen, you have a 235-year-old system, and the idea that you can't touch this, that it is not subject to a democratic overhaul, is ridiculous. I mean, how much longer can people put up with this? Another 200 years? I mean, you know, would you want the same government in Iran that you had in the late 18th century? Does Russia want to go back to the age of Catherine the Great? Does France want to go back to the age of Louis XVI? This is, you know, the American government actually dates from the final years of Louis XVI. And it has not changed fundamentally since. This is a complete absurdity that people don't realize, even Americans don't realize, how profoundly conservative and backward their political system is.
Okay.
It's remarkable.
Well, the political violence has reached proportions that could be called epic, Don DeBar, if you agree or not. But there's also been this coverage that some are saying may result in a civil war, that the political violence, because of its surge, you know, a civil war is not so out of reach, and that is exaggerated. Is it?
I think a civil war is being stoked, certainly. I don't think that the contradictions that exist materially in the United States actually lead to one. There are some sort of astroturfed ideological differences that induce that kind of polarization. I mean, this has been the tradecraft of the CIA around the world. Look at all of Latin America. Even look at the attempted color revolution in Iran recently, and the things that happen around the world like this. They go in, they have a media that divides the population, and they fight over things that are insignificant. A major policy is made behind the scenes. And, you know, the fact that I don't understand what the process would be, the democratic process would be in the United States to amend the Constitution, because I don't understand what democratic institution would conduct it.
Very well. I'm sorry, I got to jump in because we're just out of time here. Don DeBar, I do apologize. I'm sorry, we're just out of time. Activist and commentator Don DeBar, there, journalist and author Daniel Lazare, thank you so much for your contribution.
Thank you.
And with that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight. From Miko Vitahwe and the team, it's goodbye until next time.